The cowboy waited in the church, all by himself. He shifted in the empty pew, the silence of the place louder than a gunshot. He wondered if she was even going to show up. Outside, the good folks of Pine Ridge whispered. They said the broken mountain man was a fool, a worthless hermit who thought a woman would actually marry him. They figured he'd wait there till sunset, then slink back to his failing ranch in shame, forever alone. But then the church doors creaked open. A woman stepped inside, a determined school teacher, fleeing a world that had been burned to the ground around her. She was looking for sanctuary. He was looking for survival. It was a marriage of convenience. But neither of them knew the truth about Pine Ridge. Neither of them knew that hidden forces in this small frontier town had been watching, waiting, waiting for this exact moment to spring their trap. And their desperate arrangement wasn't a solution, it was the bait. 3 weeks earlier, Jedediah Clark hammered fence posts under a blistering Colorado sun. His hands were calloused, his shirt was patched. The fence line stretched on forever, across land that wasn't his and never would be. That's when Sheriff Amos Greer rode up, a cruel smile on his face. Two deputies flanked him, their badges glinting like a wolf's eyes in the sun. "Well, well," Greer drawled, "if it ain't the man planning to get himself a bride. You really think some woman's gonna show up for damaged goods like you?" Jed just kept hammering. The sound was a lonely rhythm against the empty plains. "Remember what happened last time?" Greer pushed. "That pretty little Sarah took one look at your family history and ran faster than a spooked Mustang." The hammer stopped mid-swing. Jed's knuckles were white. "Can't blame her," one of the deputies sneered. "What decent woman wants to marry into that kind of bloodline?" Jed set down the hammer. He faced them. His jaw was a hard line of stone, but he didn't say a word. "This mail-order bride scheme is pure foolishness," Greer said, leaning forward in his saddle. "No respectable woman's gonna want a half-breed ranch hand with empty pockets." The sheriff spurred his horse and rode off, their laughter trailing behind them like dust and poison. That night, Jed sat at his kitchen table, reading a letter by the faint light of a single candle. The paper was worn thin, creased from being read and reread. Miss Rosalie Given, of Philadelphia, had agreed to the arrangement. Her handwriting was neat, educated. She was a professional. He wondered what kind of desperation had driven a woman like that to answer his ad. 2,000 miles away, Rosalie Given packed the last of her belongings into a battered leather satchel. The smell of smoke still clung to her clothes, a ghost from 3 weeks ago. Her schoolhouse had burned to the ground in a single night. 23 children, children of freed slaves, had lost their only chance at an education. She had lost everything else. The letter from the matrimonial agency lay on her narrow bed. A cowboy in Pine Ridge, Colorado, sought a practical wife. No mention of love, no talk of romance, just partnership, just survival. She folded her teaching certificates carefully and tucked them between her spare dress and a worn Bible. Whatever was waiting for her in those mountains, it had to be better than the hatred that had burned her world down. The stagecoach journey took 6 long days. Rosalie watched the world change from rolling green hills to harsh, jagged mountains. Each mile was a mile further from her old life, a mile closer to a man she'd never even seen. Pine Ridge appeared like a mirage. Weathered wooden buildings lined a single dirt road. The mountains loomed on all sides like the walls of a prison. The stage driver helped her down. He tipped his hat, and the whole town went silent. Conversations stopped. Store owners paused their sweeping. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, their eyes fixed on the black woman who had just appeared in their midst. Rosalie straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked toward the small white church at the end of the street. Her footsteps were the only sound in the sudden, heavy silence. Behind her, the whispers began. Inside the church, Jed Clark waited. He wore his only clean shirt. His hands were scrubbed raw. He'd tried to slick back his dark hair with water, but a few stubborn strands had already escaped. The church door opened. Rosalie stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The man at the altar was taller than she'd imagined, with broad shoulders and skin weathered by the sun. His eyes held a weariness that matched her own. They approached each other slowly, like two cautious animals. "Miss Gibbons." His voice was deep, roughened by years of shouting over the wind. "Mr. Clark." She nodded once, formal, precise. The preacher emerged from the shadows, Bible in hand. Reverend Hayes had agreed to do the ceremony for $2 silver. No questions asked. Outside, the townsfolk pressed against the windows, their faces a gallery of disapproval. Sheriff Greer stood on the church steps, his arms crossed, a look of pure disgust on his face. The ceremony was over in 8 minutes. Jed's hands trembled slightly as he slipped a simple gold band onto Rosalie's finger. She watched him do it, her expression unreadable. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, they didn't kiss. They shook hands. A business arrangement sealed. As they walked back through town, now a married couple, they faced a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Store owners turned their backs. Women pulled their children closer. Men spat in the dust as they passed. That night in Jed's small, bare cabin, they sat across from each other at a rough wooden table. A single oil lamp flickered between them. "This is temporary," Rosalie said, her voice quiet, "until we both find something better." Jed nodded. Separate bedrooms, separate lives. Just partners on paper. Neither of them spoke of the loneliness that had driven them to this moment. Neither of them mentioned the fear that this might be their last chance at survival. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the pines, carrying the promise of winter and the whispered threats of a town that wanted them both gone. The first 3 days of their marriage passed in a heavy, awkward silence. Jed was gone before dawn each day, working as a hired hand on neighboring ranches. Rosalie swept the dusty cabin, mended his torn shirts, and cooked simple meals they ate without a single word passing between them. The new gold wedding rings felt foreign and heavy on their fingers. On the fourth morning, a fine black carriage rolled up the dirt path to their cabin. Gold trim gleamed in the sunlight. The driver wore a pressed uniform. Jed emerged from the barn, Hay still clinging to his work shirt. A thin man in a dark city suit stepped down from the carriage. He carried a leather briefcase and wore spectacles that caught the morning light. "Mr. Jedediah Clark?" Jed just nodded, wiping his hands on his pants. "I am attorney Benjamin Walsh from Denver. I represent the estate of your late uncle, Ezra Clark." Rosalie appeared in the cabin doorway, drawn by the formal tone. Walsh opened his briefcase. "Your uncle passed away 6 weeks ago. He has named you the sole heir to his property and all his holdings." The lawyer handed Jed a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "The Broken Arrow Ranch consists of 8,000 acres, 2,000 head of cattle, and 3 active silver mine claims in the Northern Territory." Jed's hands shook as he broke the seal. The documents inside contained more numbers than he had ever seen in his life. "The estimated value," Walsh continued, his voice flat and professional, "exceeds $200,000. You are now one of the wealthiest men in the Colorado Territory." The words hung in the air. Rosalie gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. Within hours, the news had spread through Pine Ridge like a plague. The broken-down cowboy, the man who could barely afford coffee, had inherited a fortune. Sheriff Greer was the first to arrive. He rode up with his hat in his hands, his usual cruel smile replaced by a look of forced politeness. "Jed, my friend," Greer said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "heard about your good fortune. Always knew you were destined for great things." Behind him came the bank president, the mayor, and every merchant in town. They lined up like beggars, each one offering congratulations and business proposals. Mrs. Henderson from the general store brought a fresh-baked pie. "Always thought you were a fine man, Jed. Just needed the right opportunity." The same woman had refused to sell him flour on credit just 3 days earlier. By evening, the small cabin was overflowing with visitors. They praised Jed's character, his intelligence, his natural leadership. But with every compliment they gave him, their treatment of Rosalie grew colder. They looked right through her. They spoke around her. She was an inconvenience, a temporary problem. "Of course, Jed," Mayor Williams suggested, his eyes sliding past Rosalie, "now that your situation has changed, you might consider more suitable arrangements." The implication was as subtle as a punch to the gut. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, leaned in conspiratorially. "There are several fine young ladies from proper families who would make excellent wives for a man of your new standing." Rosalie just kept serving coffee, her face a mask of polite indifference. She was invisible. After the last of the visitors had finally left, she found Jed standing outside, staring up at the mountains. The inheritance papers lay scattered across the kitchen table. "They want you to get rid of me," she said, her voice quiet. He turned to face her, the moonlight catching the hard angles of his face. "I know. It would make sense," she said, testing him. "You could have anyone now." Jed just looked at her. In 3 days, she had transformed his chaotic cabin into something resembling a home. His shirts were mended. His meals were ready. "What do you think we should do?" he asked. The question stunned her. No one had asked her opinion about anything in months. "I think," she said carefully, "we should move to your uncle's ranch and continue our arrangement. But the pressure from this town will only get worse." The next morning, they loaded their few possessions into Jed's old wagon. The Broken Arrow Ranch was 15 miles north, nestled in a valley between two towering peaks. The main house was 3 stories high, with wraparound porches and carved wooden railings. The barns and outbuildings dotted the property like a small village. Rosalie walked through the grand rooms in a daze. Dust-covered expensive furniture and imported carpets. Crystal chandeliers hung dark and forgotten. The place felt like a sleeping giant. She found Jed in the ranch office, staring at ledgers filled with numbers he barely understood. Cattle counts, mine production reports, payroll for 40 employees. The weight of it all was crushing him. "I can help with the books," she offered. He looked up, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "You know about business?" "I managed the budgets for 3 schools," she said, "and coordinated supply purchases for the entire district." Rosalie pulled up a chair and got to work. Her quick mind absorbed the details of the ranch operation in less than an hour. She identified inefficiencies, miscalculations, and areas for improvement with the precision of a military strategist. As she worked, Jed watched her. He saw her transform chaos into order. Her fingers moved across the ledger pages like a pianist playing a familiar song. This quiet, reserved woman possessed an intelligence that surpassed any man he had ever known. For the first time since their wedding, they were working side by side. The awkwardness between them began to dissolve, replaced by a grudging, growing respect. A partnership. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, heavy with the promise of change. In 2 short weeks, Rosalie had the ranch house humming with efficiency. She organized supply deliveries, coordinated repairs, and established new routines for the household staff. The crystal chandeliers gleamed. The Persian rugs glowed with color. Jed found himself watching her with a growing sense of awe. She moved through complex problems with a quiet confidence that was both intimidating and deeply attractive. They still had separate bedrooms on opposite ends of the second floor, but their daily interactions became easier, more natural. Their breakfast conversations were about ranch operations. Their evening discussions were about cattle prices and mine production. But then, a knock at the front door interrupted their new routine. Jed opened it to find a well-dressed stranger in an expensive suit. The man's smile was perfectly practiced. His handshake was firm, but cold. "Marcus Thompson from Denver," the man said. "Heard about your recent good fortune. I thought we might discuss some investment opportunities." Thompson's eyes swept the grand foyer. He carried himself like a man who was used to getting whatever he wanted. Over coffee, he outlined his proposal. He could arrange profitable deals, connect Jed with influential contacts, and ensure the ranch's continued success. "Of course," Thompson added smoothly, "presentation matters in high society. Image is everything." His gaze flickered toward Rosalie as she served the coffee. The meaning was clear. Thompson visited 3 more times that week. Each time he pushed harder for a partnership. He brought contracts, financial projections, and stories of other clients whose fortunes he had multiplied. During his final visit, his true agenda came out. "My daughter Charlotte," he said, "would make an excellent hostess for a man of your position. She's educated, well-connected, and comes from one of Denver's finest families." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. That night, the first blizzard of winter hit without warning. Snow fell in thick, blinding curtains, driven by a howling wind that shook the house to its foundations. Within hours, the drifts were as high as the first-floor windows. They were completely cut off. For the first time since their wedding, they were truly alone. The isolation stripped away their careful politeness. The conversations became more honest, less guarded. They shared meals by the fire, reading in a comfortable silence. On the third night of the storm, Rosalie found Jed staring into the fire, his face a mask of old pain. "Sarah left me because of what I am," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear him. "I'm half Cherokee. My grandmother was full blood." He'd never spoken those words aloud to anyone. Rosalie set down her book. "My school in Philadelphia," she said, her own voice low, "was for the children of freed slaves. The community called it unnatural, dangerous. They burned it to the ground." The fire crackled between them. "I had 23 students," she continued, her voice full of a fierce, sad pride. "The night they burned us out, someone painted words on my door. They told me to leave town, or I would face worse than a fire." Jed looked at her, really looked at her. This quiet, proper school teacher had risked everything to educate children the world wanted to forget. She had more courage than any 10 men he knew. "Sarah said she couldn't bear the shame of having mixed-blood children," he admitted, the old wound still raw. "She left me standing at the altar." "People fear what they don't understand," Rosalie said, "but their fear doesn't define our worth." The blizzard raged for 6 more days. In their forced confinement, a new intimacy grew. During the storm's final night, they sat together on the parlor sofa, reviewing financial reports. Their shoulders touched as they leaned over the same ledger. Neither of them moved away. "Marcus Thompson wants to buy the ranch," Jed said suddenly. Rosalie looked up. "All of it," he said. "The cattle, the mines, the land. He's offered $300,000, well above its market value." She studied his face. "What do you want to do?" "6 months ago, I would have sold it in a heartbeat," he said. "But now—" He looked around the warm fire-lit room, at the organized papers, at the woman sitting beside him. "Now I think we have something worth keeping." The word "we" hung between them. A bridge. Outside, the storm was finally breaking. But inside the ranch house, something deeper than the weather had changed forever. And what they didn't know was that the storm had been a blessing in disguise. Because while they were trapped inside, getting to know the truth of each other, Marcus Thompson had been making his final move. 3 days after the blizzard ended, Marcus Thompson returned. He brought his daughter with him. Charlotte Thompson was everything Rosalie was not: pale, blonde, and dripping with the casual arrogance of old money. "My daughter wanted to see your magnificent ranch," Thompson said. "She has such an appreciation for fine properties." Charlotte glided through the house like she already owned it, critiquing the furniture, suggesting changes. "The house needs a woman's touch," she declared, her eyes sliding right over Rosalie, who was serving them tea. "Someone who understands proper society." That evening, after they'd left, Jed found Rosalie in the kitchen, her movements sharp with a barely contained anger. "She's everything you should want," Rosalie said, not looking at him. "Beautiful, educated, socially acceptable." "Is that what you think I want?" Jed asked. "It's what makes sense," she shot back. "It's what the world expects." The pressure mounted. The bank president visited, talking about loans that required a more established social presence. The mayor suggested hosting community events. Every conversation was a thinly veiled suggestion that Jed needed a different kind of wife. Then Sheriff Greer started arresting Jed's ranch hands on trumped-up charges, drunk and disorderly, disturbing the peace. Each arrest cost Jed $50 in bail money and crippled his workforce at critical times. Rosalie noticed the pattern. She tracked the arrests, her sharp mind seeing the strategy. Someone was deliberately sabotaging them. Late one evening, while organizing papers in the ranch office, she found it. A letter fallen behind the desk addressed to Sheriff Greer in Thompson's handwriting. It was a conspiracy. Thompson and Greer were working together, orchestrating everything: the social pressure, the arrests, to force Jed to sell. But the letter hinted at something more, something sinister. Rosalie's search became more frantic. She felt a loose floorboard under the rug. She pried it up, and there, wedged beneath, was another document. It was a surveyor's report, dated just weeks before Jed's uncle had died. Her hands trembled as she read. a massive silver vein, worth millions, one of the richest deposits in the entire Colorado Territory. Jed's uncle had discovered it just 3 days before his natural death. Thompson had known. He and Greer had arranged Ezra's death to look like an accident. Their plan was to pressure Jed into selling cheap before he knew the true value of what he owned. Rosalie realized with a wave of cold terror that they weren't just fighting for the ranch. They were fighting for their lives. She worked through the night, her mind clear and sharp. This was a battle she knew how to fight. She gathered her evidence. She wrote letters to the territorial governor, to federal mining authorities, to law enforcement agencies outside of Greer's control. Her years of fighting for her school had taught her how to navigate bureaucracy, how to present a case that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, she laid it all out for Jed, the evidence of conspiracy, of murder. "We have to leave," he said, his face pale. "Disappear." Rosalie shook her head. "Running won't stop them. They'll just find us." Her letters were already on their way. "The federal marshals are coming," she said. "We just have to stay alive until they get here." 3 days later, Thompson and Greer rode up to the ranch house. They brought an escort of armed men. "Time to conclude our business," Thompson announced, holding up a portfolio of papers. "I have a court order, signed by Judge Morrison, declaring you mentally unfit to manage this property. The ranch is now under my control." As Thompson's men advanced, Rosalie stepped forward. "I wouldn't take another step," she said, her voice ringing with authority. She held up a telegram that had arrived that morning. "The federal marshal's office has launched an investigation," she announced. "Warrants have been issued for your arrest, for conspiracy, and for the murder of Ezra Clark." Thompson's face went white. "This is impossible. You're just an ignorant woman." "I documented everything," Rosalie said. Just then, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. A dozen federal marshals rode toward the ranch house, their badges glinting in the sun. Thompson grabbed for his pistol, but it was too late. He was surrounded. His hired guns threw down their weapons. Even Sheriff Greer raised his hands in surrender. The lead marshal, a man whose reputation for justice was legendary, dismounted and approached Rosalie. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "your evidence package was the most comprehensive case documentation I've seen in 20 years." Within an hour, the conspirators were in a prison wagon, bound for Denver. That evening, Jed and Rosalie stood on their front porch watching the sunset. "You saved our lives," Jed said quietly. "You saved this ranch. Everything." "We saved each other," Rosalie corrected. The next morning, the territorial governor himself arrived. He offered Rosalie a position to establish a new education system for the entire territory. He offered Jed an appointment as the regional mining commissioner to oversee the very claims Thompson had tried to steal. 6 months later, the Broken Arrow Ranch was the bustling headquarters for both the new school system and the mining commission. Rosalie had established 3 schools, educating children from all backgrounds. The silver from Jed's mines funded it all. Their partnership had evolved into something deeper, stronger. Their separate bedrooms now felt like a foolish tradition. On a crisp December morning, Jed found Rosalie in the library, reviewing plans for 3 new schoolhouses. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "When we married, it was a business arrangement." She looked up, her heart suddenly beating faster. "But somewhere along the way," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it stopped feeling like an arrangement." "I know," she whispered. "I love you," Jed said simply. "Not the woman I married for convenience, but the person you are. Your courage, your kindness." Tears filled Rosalie's eyes. "I love you too," she said. "The man who saw worth in me when the world had thrown me away." He reached across the desk and took her hands. "Would you consider making this real?" Her answer was a kiss that erased months of careful distance. On New Year's Day, they renewed their vows in the same small church where they had first met as strangers. This time, it was filled with friends. This time, when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, they kissed, a kiss filled with the promise of a future they had built together, against all odds. That spring, Rosalie discovered she was carrying their first child. Standing on the porch one morning, her hand on her growing belly, Jed's arm around her shoulders, they looked out at the empire they had built, an empire of schools and honest business and hope. The cowboy who had waited alone in an empty church hadn't just found a bride. He had found his equal. And the teacher who had fled a world of hate had found a man worthy of her courage, her intelligence, and her heart. If you believe that two broken souls can sometimes heal each other, and that true partnership can change the world, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories coming that you won't want to miss. Thanks for listening.